At a dreadful time in Chinese history, somebody wrote this very sad poem. And this, unfortunately, is the way that a lot of people in adversity think in China. When I was young, I did not know the taste of grief. I used to climb tall towers and forcibly compose romantic odes about grief. Now, I fully know the taste of grief. I would love to speak, but I do not. I would love to speak, but I remain silent and merely say, the air is cool. What a lovely autumn. Enough of these autumns. We need no more. Those people must speak up. They know the taste of grief and they deserve better. And if they cannot speak, we should speak for them. Not against China, but against the Chinese Communist Party.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
This is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Matthew Henderson. Now, most of you won't have heard of Matthew Henderson, but he's an absolutely fascinating man. He's a former diplomat who used to work in China. He's an expert in China. He's going to be telling me how China became almost a communist superpower, how China's ambition is to dominate the world economically and politically, how China is using the coronavirus pandemic to expand its reach, to expand its influence. You can watch all of our interviews that we do every single week called Burning Questions in the link below. But for now, enjoy this fascinating discussion all about China and how it became such a superpower. So let's start by talking about the coronavirus crisis and China. Do you believe that they mishandled the pandemic from the beginning? Do you believe that they covered up certain aspects of the pandemic?
I think evidence for that is very clear. The point is essentially that at a vital period when they already knew that there was an infectious disease spreading across the community in Wuhan, they failed to draw this to the attention of the World Health Organization in a transparent, full and accurate manner, as they should have done under the terms of the international health regulations. As a consequence of that, it was impossible to advise and intervene and go forward with a proper approach to managing the outbreak before it was impossible to do so, because it had spread too far. Essentially, as a result of those first 2 or 3 weeks, the pandemic that we now have has happened. It could have been prevented, and it was not. That is a matter of fact.
And how do you think the West should respond to the kind of mishandling of this pandemic from China?
I think it's very important that the West should not engage in blame for blame's sake. This is not a competition as to who can be the most aggressive and the most unhelpful. We are trying to achieve, after all, a successful outcome for all of us. And what that really means is, if at all possible, even now, it would be a great help to learn everything we possibly could about what the Chinese themselves learnt during that vital period when the true nature of the origins and the infectivity and the general behaviour of the virus in practice became apparent for the first time. This is a precious legacy that we really need to get hold of as soon as we can. That would be an enormous bit of progress that could be achieved quite easily, I believe.
Why does this happen in China? I mean, in 2002, we saw the SARS virus, and the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, they basically covered up the amount of people who had SARS. They weren't honest about it until a whistleblower came out and said, well, actually, there's a lot more cases than you're admitting to. And yet again, we've seen this kind of the same pattern of behaviour in 2019 and in 2020. And on top of that, we've seen the wet market issue as well. I mean, they've got wet markets all around the world, but in China, they failed to regulate these wet markets, which we all know leads, unfortunately, to viruses jumping from animals to humans. So why are we seeing a sort of pattern of events where China isn't learning necessarily from their mistakes?
Well, first of all, there's some basic facts about the biology. The Chinese environment, whether it's the urban or the rural environment, lends itself very, very well, if that's the right word for it, to the emergence of extremely dangerous infectious viruses that spread from animals to people. Now, you would have hoped that as a result of the SARS event, when the World Health Organization, recognizing this, deliberately strengthened its regulations, that China too would have learnt the lesson. They did some splendid work on the virology. What they don't seem to have done is done the same amount of splendid work on the basic way in which Chinese society has been allowed to operate. If anything, matters have got much worse. Back at the time of SARS, there was a natural spread from bats and civet cats and various other animals into the community of a number of types of viruses, one of which turned out to be SARS. That having been identified, which it was, by the Chinese themselves, immediately steps should have been taken to halt the entirely unnecessary, cruel and pointless practice of raising these animals, not only in catching them in the wild, which is how the demand used to be supplied, but actually farming them, which of course incredibly increases the risk of spread, because there are people actually day to day feeding these things, preparing them for market, transporting them, and so on. There's an industry of risk. This is avoidable, it should have been avoided, and one hopes it will never happen again. However, it must be said, so much money was being made by so many vested interests in that process that you can see why a bit of a blind eye was cast. There is, however, no excuse whatsoever for not following up properly once that's been identified as the cause.
And do you think that China is trying to use the coronavirus pandemic, is trying to sort of use that event to increase its influence, to increase its stature across the world, and to take advantage of perhaps other economies, which, Western economies, which may be failing, which may have deep recessions because of this coronavirus pandemic? Do you think the Chinese Communist Party will use this as an opportunity to better themselves?
To think of such a thing fills one with dread. It almost sounds unthinkable, but the fact of the matter is the evidence suggests very strongly that that is exactly what's going on. That having received a mortal blow that was self-inflicted, they then, having rallied and stood up, see the rest of the world now in a miserable state of disarray, and actually a state of disarray which suits their purposes very well. We are all of us now revealed in our true dependency on China, in some cases for the very medical equipment that's needed for our doctors to contend with the infection, but in other cases the product streams which will dry up, or the imports that will dry up if we continue to probe into their responsibility and to criticise them. So there is now a leveraging of existing factors, demand now for help with the medical problems, and demand now also for the resources that flood in when you're still able to trade with China in the way that you could before. Both of those are being used as weapons against us. It is a most dreadful state of affairs.
And I think that goes a bit into sort of China's motivations, and that's something that I think people in the West perhaps misunderstand or don't understand what their kind of ultimate goal is. Can you talk a little bit about the Chinese Communist Party's goals and what they really want in the future and moving across when we get out of this pandemic?
Yes. The unification of communist China with the rest of the world in economic terms is a new phenomenon, and it's one which they set great store by. Having really not done terribly well organising their domestic economy, they've now globalised in such a way that they hope to be able to export risk and gain profit from a much wider exposure in world markets. Now, all of this is all very well in its way, but unfortunately it hasn't quite panned out as we thought it would as well. So instead of becoming friends with a China which was more like us, which was more open to engagement with multilateral processes, which became a correct and full member of international structures to do with the United Nations and so on and so forth, what we've seen is them masquerading as such and taking advantage of the opportunities that membership of the UN and so on provided, but not actually honouring their commitments to that, as we've seen in the case of the World Health Organization so dreadfully, but in other aspects of international legislation as well. This is essentially because China has never really bought into the multilateral model. The relationships which have been dressed up and hung together as the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which is supposed to be a global programme for the world to benefit from, are actually a series of very transactional bilateral relationships, many of them of quite long standing, which have been glued together by a lot of talk, the sort of talk that informed the famous speech in 2017 at Davos, when Xi Jinping for the first time really put his personal seal of approval on the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, essentially as a pitch for world economic domination to replace the US-led international order with a Chinese-led order, where China in some sort of way took over that mantle of control with something much less transactional, something very much win-win, the language he used, whereby China became the patron of the developing world in a way that the competitive, market-led West had not, and somehow or other have acquired that overall control that the party itself always wants.
So the West has sort of built up what we might call an international rules-based system with organisations such as the UN and the WHO. And this pandemic perhaps shows that China doesn't necessarily work on that same kind of rules-based system. They're quite happy to go around the WTO, perhaps maybe try and manipulate the WHO, that is. And as you said there, they're using the Belt and Road Initiative to perhaps go around the WTO and make their own bilateral relationships around the world. So is this kind of part of a whole package that Xi Jinping's goal is basically to sort of boost China's interest without having to take any of the kind of other stuff that comes with being an international player, which includes cooperation and sort of working with other countries and working with international partners.
Again, the evidence very strongly suggests that you are right. And perhaps the clearest example hitherto of that has been the way in which, having moved aggressively into international maritime space in the South and East China Seas, and having been challenged by the international regulations that should have prevented that behaviour, they considered the law of the sea to be trivial and to be rejected out of hand. Now, something as fundamental as that actually affects not only the regional security and stability of trade, but actually global trade, given how many nations depend on freedom of navigation through the Malacca Straits and so on, and all the way up to Japan and beyond. Given that that is the case, this demonstration of contempt for the commitments that are made when you sign up to international agreements is a pattern that I'm afraid is now seen to be recurring.
Now, a lot of people listening to this may think, well, China is a big economy, it's a big market for the West to trade with. It's led to a lot of prosperity for people in the West in terms of, let's say cheaper products or more business opportunities for us. What's so wrong with, trading with China and having China as a global player? What's so wrong? I mean, there's basically, we make a load of money and they're pretty, a benign power. What's so wrong with cooperating with China?
Nothing in principle is wrong with cooperating with anybody, particularly when they are undoubtedly a major driver of tremendous global growth. It is a very significant and fact that one should take one's hat off to, that in the very short space as America began to disconnect itself from the very forward global position that it used to enjoy, China stepped in and in no time at all became the largest trading partner of almost every single nation in the Indo-Pacific, not to speak of areas much further afield. Unfortunately, the way in which that was achieved was not simply a question of market forces operating in a consensual, fully understood and fully collegiate way. On the contrary, China manipulated those market forces. China deliberately undercut the domestic industries of countries that produced raw materials such as steel. China deliberately undercut the prices of more sophisticated products, particularly the famous examples of Huawei telephones and so on and so forth, with a view to supplanting domestic capability in the countries that were good at making those sorts of items. In other words, one has seen the weaponization of state wealth as a means of competing unfairly in global marketplaces and taking over increasingly large shares of sectors where they did not need to achieve such a level of monopoly, with a view to creating dependencies that could be exploited in some cases politically as well as economically, and in others even militarily.
Now, we've talked about the word China a lot in this interview, and it's such a behemoth country. I mean, it's the biggest nation on earth. Over 1 billion people live there. But when people think about China, I think in the West particularly, they may just have this sort of solitary view of a sort of united country. The Communist Party and Xi Jinping are rulers of this country, and the country has sort of one aim, and people have a very sort of mono view of China. But can you just explain to people a little bit about China's history, because it's not always been like that. Perhaps it isn't even like that today. So can you sort of explain to people the moving parts that's going on in China, and what is Chinese identity? Because that's the big nut that I think people in the West haven't quite cracked. It's quite it's about understanding who China is, and then you can understand their motivations. So can you just explain who China is a little bit?
This is an excellent question, a very profound one, and needless to say, it includes quite a lot of very different components. The first thing I would say is that right at the start, we have to distinguish between the idea of China as an entity, historical, geographical, and so on, and ethnic, and the idea of the PRC, or rather, as I would refer to it, the party-state apparatus of the People's Republic of China. China is now, as when we're talking about it, really essentially the will, the intentions, the competencies, and the credibility of the Chinese Communist Party, which has actually only been in charge of China for a very short portion of the entire Chinese historical day, a mere 70 years. We'll come back later perhaps to exactly what's happened during that time, but let's put that in a very clear perspective. The idea that we call China is essentially something that's existed for just over 2 millennia. The idea that somehow or other part of that geographical territory would be unified, as it was in 221 BC, by a single ruler, a single system, a single culture, script, and mode of governance. That is, as I say, something that has been around for those 2,000 years and more. However, within that 2,000-year period, much of the time it was more of an idea in theory than in practice. For much of the time in Chinese history, the country that we now call China was not unified. It was composed of collections of power groups, of warring states, very often called the Three Kingdoms. As they said, there was a period that they themselves referred to as the Jianguo, the warring countries. There are 6 dynasties, northern and southern regimes. There are periods when the entire country was ruled by Mongolians, by Manchus, the last dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, as you know, dating back to the middle of the 17th century, was effectively a situation in which the ethnic Han Chinese population, and much other parts of the country too, were dominated by a very, very much smaller steppe race with a different language, a different religion, and a different worldview. In other words, this idea of the monolithic, it's stretched over the last few years, this notion of China as with 2,000, 3,000, I think we're up to 5,000 years of unbroken Chinese unity. This is a dream, it's a nonsense, and it can only be sold to people who don't stop and think. How could that possibly be so? It was not so, and it never will be so. So Chinese history shows dynasties come and dynasties go. There are reasons why they rise and why they fall. Traditionally, in the old order, it was assumed that you could rise to power if you were worthy of it, and you would remain in power as long as you showed that worthiness. And when a dynasty became corrupt or weak or venal or a mixture of the three, or indeed too ambitious, it was quite likely to lose the moral authority, what's called the mandate of heaven, and it would fall and it would be replaced, hopefully by something better. This is a pattern that repeats itself regularly through Chinese history, and I would imagine that there are people now sitting in China in the grip of this Communist Party and seeing what it's achieved, if that's the right way to put it, over the 70 years that it has unfortunately been in charge. They will be hoping that the mandate of heaven might change hands again, and not too far hence.
And this is the thing about communism that's interesting, and I really want to try and get in people's heads what China is and how they've become what they are today. And this whole idea of sort of uniformity of, you've got, basically you can just put people into different classes, you've got the working class or whatever. And communism is this great sort of trying to unite everyone as equal. But in China, they've had lots of different religions and ethnicities and cultures and various different groups of people, all united now, obviously under the Communist Party. But they've all got different ideas, and it's not like if you say China, it's like saying Europe. You've got lots of different moving parts there. So I find that really interesting. So we come up to 1946. World War II has just ended. The world is in chaos. Lots of things, lots of moving parts. We're in flux, really. The Japanese Empire, it has been defeated. How do the communists take power? And can you sort of contrast that between the Soviet Union? Because China, people might think, oh, communist China, communist Soviet Union, they're pretty similar, but we know that they're completely different.
Well, right at the start, there was far more in common in theory at any rate. The Chinese Communist Party is very much the junior of the Russians, and it used exactly the same texts. The problem is that when you borrow stuff that's been written by a 19th century intellectual in Britain, looking at a post-industrial revolution society, in Europe, which is already struggling with the tensions that have broken out between a modern economic world and the traditional leadership by royal families, when you think about that and the way in which the idea of Marxism was formulated by Karl Marx and the others, you must realise that it is a very poor fit indeed in an oriental, traditional, agrarian society without a developed economy, without the class structures, the proletariat and so on, that are necessary for a traditional Marxist revolution. The fit just was not there. And it's even worse when you think what it's like trying to translate it. For example, this language had gone from English very often into German, or started in German, then gone to Russian, and then has to be turned into Chinese, which is a completely different language. Effectively, what you get is something a little bit like the Book of Mormon. It looks like scripture, it sounds like scripture, but we're not really sure that it is, because it doesn't seem quite to add up. You imagine trying to translate dialectical materialism into Chinese. What on earth are you going to say? And how are you going to explain to people what it means? I discovered this, to my great amusement, I have to say, when I first went to China, after years of studying the culture, and asked Chinese people what they understood by dialectical materialism. And most of them could remember the word, but what it meant was a little bit beyond them. Now that shows you that the roots of communism, as we now see it, were never deep in that kind of way. Instead, what we had was a foreign cult with a foreign vocabulary, a set of methodologies, a set of very clear-cut motives, ideas and aims, a great power behind it, which was the Soviet Union, and a group of brilliant, aggressive people seeing a chance to retrieve control of their state from years of humiliation by the West and by other powers, with that as their guiding light to charge forward into some sort of utopia that they hoped would come a bit faster than it had done in the West. China had not had its industrial revolution. China hadn't even had an agricultural revolution. China didn't have a proletariat, and it had no middle classes who were going to start getting difficult and demanding more in the way of control over their lives. All of that was imposed from above by theoreticians who were essentially military people who were using this as a weapon of war in the Stalinist struggle against forces that would resist them, which would never cease until the day when the communist utopia was realised. And as we all know, that never has happened. So from the word go, there was a very, very huge challenge affecting China when it was being led by communists, because they didn't really have the right grounding for anything that communism was supposed to produce. Now, what's the result of that? The result of that is that peasant agriculture is transformed into collectivized agriculture, which does not work. People aren't motivated, the machinery is not available, the crops can't be grown in that sort of way, the land is destroyed, inappropriate tree felling, inappropriate ploughing, inappropriate irrigation, a mess, in other words, which causes starvation, death and horror on a scale never before seen in the history of the world. The next problem is, what are you going to do about industry? You haven't got any. You haven't got the money to do it. But, communism, small is beautiful. Set up your own coal mine. Set up your own smelting plant. Make your own iron and steel. If there's any of it lying around, melt it down and turn it into stuff for the communist revolution to build its new buildings and bridges and railways with. It doesn't work. The stuff is rubbish. People get harmed. The environment is wrecked. This is an utter and complete failure. The great leap forward was nothing but a great leap backward. No sooner is that beginning to fade into the miserable past, and people begin to forget that about up to 30 million of people starved to death one way or the other by that stage, that we find that the Communist Party itself is beginning to fall apart. The senior leadership, resentful of Mao, contest his power. He sees his rivals as existential threats to his personal control of the entire story, and the cult of Mao becomes the cult of Mao, the anarchist who says to young people, overthrow your schools, learning is bad for you, bomb the headquarters, and let's loose an absolute nightmare once again that throws the country into disarray for a decade. A decade in which, by the way, the people so affected, which goes over 3 generations, actually found their careers ruined, their education destroyed, and basically the moral tone of society turned from something that was nominally hopeful and positive into mutual mistrust, misery, danger and death, yet once more. Now, I saw this at first hand when I first visited China to stay permanently in the early 80s, and I can assure you it was a very dreadful thing to see. So communism turned into, from having been a Western construct artificially imposed with a collective leadership that was supposed to deliver some sort of social and political change along a controlled path, becomes something dominated by an autocrat who becomes increasingly insane and eventually has to be retired, and fortunately leaves the scene just before the country dissolves into utter ruin and horror. And it was at that point that Deng Xiaoping, having seen what was happening, emerged as a new leader with strength and vision and competence in his curious way, and saved them, at least for the time being. So communism, having morphed into that cult of the individual, and then having decided that it had to stop pretending that that would really work and that money was a useful thing to have after all, started allowing people to make money. And of course, it being a large country and people having had a lot of energy cramped and stifled for so long, once let loose, made a great deal of it. But they did so not in a properly planned way. The military-industrial complex, the heavy industry, the areas of the country where nothing but mining and the preparation of mining materials into something that can be used for construction, those areas rapidly become a rust belt when you're competitive through the sales of Nike and such like made in China. And the state-owned sector, which had been the underpinning and the framework of the economy previously, became an absolute albatross around the neck of the Communist Party's efforts to modernise. But they did not have the know-how, the skill and the vision to deal with that. They were afraid of being overthrown by millions of unemployed workers with no skills and nowhere to go. So when the chance came to move gradually from that dependency on the state-owned sector into a free market, they fudged it. They hadn't got the nerve, and it did not happen. So then we see an economy that's dependent on exports. It's not one where people are building up indigenous demand markets, income, avoiding the middle income trap, but basically selling more and more overseas in order to prop up growth, to keep the SOEs, to keep the funny banking system that the communists use essentially as a lending tool, and to keep, above all, the Communist Party itself going a little bit longer, a little bit further, until eventually that runs out of steam. So that is what we now see, this curious phenomenon of the capitalist communism, the Communist Party that isn't communist in terms of the ownership of the means of production, or indeed in the implementation of dialectical materialism, whatever that was supposed to be. It is simply a group of people who have control of an economy that they can't really run, which they are able to control because they provide enough growth to keep people happy, or have done hitherto, so that they won't rebel, that the mandate of heaven will not be torn from their grasp. But their capacity to do that has depended on force, on the fact that the military underpin the Communist Party themselves, that they're an instrument of state power. They exist effectively to maintain order within China in a way quite different from other defense forces. The PLA are the Praetorian Guard of the communist leadership, and the communist leader himself is the head of the military first and foremost, and the General Secretary of the Communist Party in parallel with that. So this is a different structure from any other that we've seen in the socialist or communist world. It's a completely unique Chinese phenomenon, and in many ways it has more in common with a traditional imperial system than it does with a fully regulated socialist system in the Western model.
It's fascinating. So China obviously had this period under Mao, which might call it a period of terror, where tens of millions of people are starving and dying, and then obviously Mao died in, I think, 1976, and then Deng Xiaoping becomes leader, and he starts to sort of loosen the grip of the Communist Party on the country. He sort of starts to privatize certain industries and sort of unleash the potential of the Chinese people, and then that's how China's economy booms, basically. Can we talk a little bit about the West's reaction to these events? So up until about 1971. And it's a fascinating event that happens in 1971, which I think they call it the ping-pong diplomacy. Up until about 1971, the West don't have any relations, or have very, very few relations with China. They view China in a similar way to how they viewed the Soviet Union. It's a communist state. We don't have relations. We actually recognise that the West actually recognised that China as Taiwan at the time. China didn't have a seat at the UN. It didn't have a seat at the WTO. And then in 1971 and towards the late 1970s, that begins to change. So why did the West's view change of China when you might have tens and tens of millions of people dying under Mao, and the West almost turns a complete blind eye to that, which is an unimaginable horror that happened under that communist regime, and the West just completely pivots and eventually allows China into the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, etc., etc.
It's very difficult to project oneself back into how it must have been in those days. I try to do so myself because I have actually been deeply engaged in the study of China, I can say, for nearly 50 years. And quite seriously, when I was talking to my elderly Aberdonian grandfather about China, he used to talk in terms of Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek. That was his idea of China. That was where the flame of China still flickered. It was not in this benighted and peculiar environment on the mainland, where myriads of people in blue Mao suits wandered around waving little red books. Nonetheless, I think, even then, there must have been a sense that this could perhaps at some day change in a way that the Soviet Union, as essentially a failed state with nuclear weapons, was unable to be transformed, and that in some sort of way, engaging, connecting, and interacting with China little by little could encourage the spread of a different mode, perhaps a more natural mode for China, which had been, it must be said, a great merchant state for many centuries, which was capable, although not having industrialized itself, nonetheless, of organized production and the first arms factories. A lot of the Joseph Needham books are full of detail about how the Chinese invented this and that and the other wonderful industrial processes. They just never really mobilized them. The real problem, of course, was that during the Manchu period, the Manchus really weren't interested in industry at all. They made their money by owning China, and they spent a lot of it on hunting and riding around on the most beautiful horses the world's ever seen. So there wasn't exactly a pattern of a leadership which knew what to do with a world economy. However, little by little, as you were saying, when Deng Xiaoping begins to see that getting rich is glorious, because if you don't, it'll be very inglorious indeed, a somewhat different model becomes possible. And we see the establishment of contact between groups of British businesses and American businesses, and ultimately we see this wonderful China dream emerging of the place where if you can only sell one bottle of Coca-Cola to every person in China, job done, essentially. All of which forgot something really rather important, which was that in order to do business in China, you have to play by Chinese rules, because there are none other. That means if you've got some IP that they would like, oh yes, invest in China, but we'll have the IP too. This means if you are likely to be a serious competitor in some way with existing Chinese industries and you want to invest in China, nope, that is not going to happen. So effectively for many, many years, these people spend time sitting in Beijing, making all sorts of wonderful instrumental friendships, but the money is just not coming through. And by degrees, we begin to think that that's normal, that somehow or other we've got a golden age of relations with China, when actually the balance of payments have been in our disfavour from the very word go. We're all hoping about jam tomorrow, and it never arrived, and it never will, because that isn't what China wants. China does not want to be part of a globalised world where there is interpenetration of dependencies. It wants to be the one that's calling the shots. So essentially, from that dream of, well, we won't bother about the Dalai Lama, and we won't say very much about human rights anyway, and we won't say very much about the Christians in China, who after all are more in number, or were back then, than the number of people who are members of the Communist Party. We'll ignore all these ground truths, and we'll just say, well, they're not really as communist as all that, and it'll be all right sometime, someday. It never has been, and as I say, it never will, because these people do not want to play the game as we play it. They want our IP. They want our technologies. They want advantages that they can accrue from those things, and they want to move into vacuums that they themselves have created, where they will have dependencies built up in our industrial sectors, in our ability to do research going forward on the most sophisticated and interesting technologies that are emerging out of research and development, taking place first of all in the West and then hijacked and drained by China, in order that ultimately they can surpass the West. Now we know this because we've seen the roadmap, and insofar as there is one, it's something that you can read in a document called Document Number 9, which is a party memorandum or communique that dates, we think, from 2012-13. It emerges in 2013. This document goes out at the stage when Xi Jinping was consolidating his power. And a lot of people at the time, I think, who became aware of it once it did leak, thought, well, no, it can't really be quite as stark as that. That couldn't really be a very easy message to reconcile with all of this friendship and trade and mutual support that we're hearing about. But what it actually says is the Communist Party regards liberal democracy, free trade, freedom of belief and religion, and all of the other things that underpin Western moral values and the values of the rules-based world order. All of those things are conceived of as threats to the Chinese Communist Party, which the Chinese Communist Party must seek to destroy and overthrow. Now, this is pretty stark stuff, and there is some contradiction between that and the Davos message of win-win, except, of course, that we now know that the win-win is China wins and China wins. And the rest of us are looking at our balance of payments, they're looking at our stripped-out research at universities, our techie companies bought up suddenly by aggressive moves on them, going on at this very moment, I should say, when we're down in the mud with this corona thing going around. The vultures are definitely circling. The aim was, as I say, to replace the West and take over, and in some sort of way to put China back where it is supposed to have been before the Industrial Revolution. This is the myth of Chinese history that the Chinese Communist Party have created. Yes, indeed, the very corrupt and very chaotic and very un-Chinese Manchu regime didn't do a great job in the 19th century and left China open to Western imperialism and colonial behaviours and infringements of very basic human rights and all sorts of other dreadful things that were a function of such a big vulnerability in the face of such great external power. That myth of a right to retrieve the situation by the communists, if you please, is a very, very important part of the moral basis, or as they call it, the moral legitimacy of the Communist Party and its right to impose such control on its own people as it continues to exert. It is a major stumbling block for the West as well, because a lot of people in the many years of liberal peace find it very hard to stomach the notion that we can go off and complain about human rights in Tibet or in Xinjiang or anywhere else in China, having committed such frightful atrocities in the past in India and elsewhere. This easy moral relativism that how things were then justifies how things are now stands up to no sound scrutiny whatsoever, but nonetheless it is a very simple position to slide into. The problem then arises when you expect these people to behave your way at the UN and then to carry on. You observe that they carry on doing what we've been observing over the last year in Xinjiang, locking up millions even of people there, brutalising people in the Falun Gong sect who are seen as subhuman and are subjected to the most unspeakable abuses. Tibet we need hardly speak of, alas, but very similar things have happened and continue to happen in Inner Mongolia. And generally a society that clearly does not play by any set of rules other than its own, despite being a member of this, that and the other, and a signatory to things like the international health regulations. So we have been confronted with a fundamental contradiction that we ourselves have refused to observe. How can it be that we are thinking now of allowing Chinese technology to be part of our 5G network when that same technology is deployed on a daily basis to oppress and persecute innocent people throughout China, not only the national minorities, as they call them, but also any members of Chinese society who do not toe the party line. That equipment made by those companies is something that keeps the Communist Party going. It's not for no reason at all, therefore, that those same companies, and I mean the same companies, are essential and praised champions of public security organs and ministries inside China. That is a fact. It's been exposed very clearly and incontrovertibly by excellent work that's been done by various Australian scholars of these matters using original materials. Of this there is no doubt whatsoever. How can we now, knowing what we do about the motivation of that party state, knowing what we do about its agendas, knowing what we know also about its capabilities, how can we for a moment contemplate such a folly as to consider making that part of our own mechanisms to manage and control sensitive national data? It's inconceivable.
Well, this is the fundamental choice of our times in a way. You know, the kind of relationship between China and the West, it will be the defining thing of the next few decades. I think it'll be absolutely fascinating to see how it pans out. And you talk about, you know, how we know what China's motivations are, how we know what China has been doing, the sort of atrocities and the censorship and the terrible things that they've done in the past and that they are doing now. But in a sense, I suppose we don't really know, because we're quite happy to turn a blind eye to certain things they do. The population of, let's say, Britain, I don't think it's on their radar particularly. Maybe coronavirus is making public opinion sort of turn a little bit against China, but you know, it was never really an issue. I think for many people in the West, until, you know, people like Donald Trump are coming in and saying what they're saying about China. I really want to unpack what you've had a fantastic monologue talking about basically what China's motivations are and why that perhaps isn't necessarily good for the West, to put it lightly. And I just want to get, before we unpack that, I just want to understand what the West's motivations have been throughout the last few decades in terms of China, and what the West were kind of thinking. Am I right in saying there was this sort of idea that had two prongs? The first prong is that by opening up China to Western markets and world markets, by allowing them to join the WTO as they did in 2001, by allowing them to join the UN, by creating trade relationships with China, this will help our own economies. This will create a lot of money for businesses in the West, and basically it's a bit of a cash cow for us because we've got this huge market here that we can go and trade with. And for example, the Soviet Union, we never really had that because the Soviet Union, the system would just never work with our Western system. And the second prong is that when you open up China to the world, that somehow the economic reforms will be followed by political reforms. And it was this idea that China will become more democratic, China will become less authoritarian, China will open up itself and open up its economy to the West, rather than the other way around. So is it those two kind of fundamental ideas that, first of all, it will make money for us, and second of all, it's fine because they're going to become democratic in the future? Is that kind of the main reasons the West sort of said to China, come into the world organisations that we control?
Broadly, I believe that's right. I mean, market forces undoubtedly did play a part in it all, although, as I said, they weren't always as fair and straightforward as they should have been. If you simply can't afford to pay workers to produce commodities in Britain, which they can be produced for a tenth of the price in China, little by little, it's very apparent that the gearing will that people will follow the money. And much of that following the money was extraordinarily useful because, of course, people outsourced production to China. So they're still producing the same goods, but very cheaply, and they're made to reasonably high standards and so on. Once the initial kinks are ironed out, you can outsource an awful lot of things, production components, finished goods, and so on. That's being done in China. And for a very long time, Chinese labour costs were such as to make that really very practical and sensible indeed. And China, of course, benefited enormously in the process. Little by little, we did begin to see that labour costs were going up, but at that time the emphasis had shifted from that kind of rather fundamental production to much more sophisticated and complicated sourcing chains. So China, instead of being a provider of cheap low-level products, becomes a component producer, and very often you'll get stuff which to's and fro's. It may have been in China twice almost before it's finished its job. So there was that increasingly complex and interconnected picture of dependencies, effectively, where people very, very seldom looked at the bottom lines and actually were continually focused on this, as I say, the jam tomorrow syndrome. Meanwhile, I think within China, there was this very clear campaign of equipping themselves to cope better than the West. We can benefit. Now, the Deng was very good about this. That which is foreign can be used for that which is internal. That which is old can be used for that which is new. And so a really strategic view. However, the democratic part of your argument, in the people in the West thinking that'll be all right, eventually it'll turn into another bourgeois society with the sort of division of powers and the sort of social contracts between the ruler and the ruled that we enjoy. Sooner or later, that's pretty well inevitable. Unfortunately, they didn't really look at 1989, because at the stage when people started realising that they were facing a potential political choice, and the young folk of Tiananmen Square stood up and tried to make that choice, the results were as atrocious. And not only there were smaller Tiananmens in many other parts of China, which are nowadays sadly forgotten. But at any rate, that was the point at which, with Deng now very elderly but still absolutely in control, the leadership pulled itself together and decided that what the West referred to as, what the West saw as this organic, consensual drift towards democracy was actually a Western plan to subvert the Chinese Communist Party. They called it peaceful evolution. And they said, we will not allow ourselves to be peacefully evolved. No more have they done so. That has been the norm. That's been the baseline. That is what lies behind document number 9. But for whatever reason, we have just not gone forth and figured in the way that you would have thought it would have been very easy. Now, when I say this, of course, there have always been sinologists, experts, economists, other observers of what's gone on in other parts of the world who've spotted these patterns and drawn attention to them. But as long as there was this capacity to wield the weapon of wealth, to come to places that had run out of cash and say, don't worry, to come to universities that were saying, we could really do with a bit more research grants to study this form of genome fusing or this type of graphene, pre-graphene, whatever wonderful technology it might be. We've got all these good ideas about hypersonic propulsion systems and so on, all these wonderful technologies. And wouldn't it be nice if we could share our knowledge worldwide and derive some benefits from the world markets for these products when we've worked out what to do with them that will come along further down the road. Now, of course, the Chinese are only too glad to oblige, wouldn't you be? You're going to be the market that's going to use most of this stuff, but better yet, you're going to dominate that market. So instead of waiting for the West to produce expensive kit that you have to buy. What you do is you move in, get a foothold in universities and research institutions, little by little create dependencies in terms of chairs and grants here, there and everywhere, visits to China, parallel universe of laboratories being built up in centres of excellence in China, and in no time at all people find themselves entirely dependent for their own careers as Western innovators on an informed interest and a demand for that IP inside China itself. This is an extremely dangerous situation, possibly even more dangerous than the straightforward economic dependency that we have, where the only place that produces magnesium or the only places that produces such and such a widget is China. That's bad enough. But when they're the only people who are actually in a position to use your research and development, and you yourself have been cheated of your birthright, that is not good as well, and it takes a lot more courage to deal with it.
In a minute, we're going to talk a little bit about China, how China views other countries, whether they view them as rivals or whatever, and also kind of what China's ultimate goals are in the next few decades. But first of all, I just want to focus in a bit about your past, your own personal experiences with China, and people listening to this, especially now. I know I've made a few videos about China. I've done some projects with you about China in the past. It's fascinating how many people go on the video and they comment, "Oh, this is anti-Chinese propaganda" or whatever, because a lot of people just, they may be Chinese, or they may think that China is actually a good power and they're sort of a good alternative to the West, and they may think, well, this guy, he's just some anti-China British propaganda person. But can you just explain that actually you don't hate China? I mean, maybe you do. Can you tell, what's your kind of background and why are you so interested in China? Where's this kind of obsession with China come from?
I think it's very important to realise that when we talk about China, we mean China largely without communists in the story. And hopefully that will one day be the case again. China is undoubtedly one of the world's greatest civilizations, with many continuities that are not simply political and military continuities of understanding and cumulative tradition, immense creativity, immense profundity, an extraordinary relationship between humanity as it's perceived and the natural world, all sorts of things that sit very well indeed with a holistic view of creation and environment and so on. All of these ideas were fundamental to Chinese culture and should, I hope, someday become so again. So for me, as a young man growing up in an academic and intellectual household, the fresh air that radiated from millennia of Chinese thought and art and culture generally was intensely attractive, and it remains so still. It's a great loss to the world now that unfortunately what should be the heartland of that culture is effectively decultured. Very little of this remains. There are expensive museums and all sorts of extraordinary films and all sorts of other ways in which they milk and exploit their culture, but it is effectively on hold, because so much of what's said about it now distorts it and perverts it and turns it into an instrument of communist power. The cult of Confucius as a sort of China-branded alternative to Western democracy is a particularly pernicious one. Confucius, the sage, the saint, I would say, really, and the philosopher, wouldn't recognize any of what is said about his contribution and his thinking and the way in which so-called Confucius Institutes are used effectively as United Front Work Department camps in foreign countries to spread poison. The way in which that is done is shameful. It is actually a blot on the face of Chinese culture and Chinese civilization. So I hold no axe against that. I'm somebody who has benefited massively and will continue to do so from my capacity to think about the way in which the West has conceived of religious faith and social responsibility and as I say, the relationship between the human world and the world of nature and creation at large. All of these things are a massive contribution to our understanding of life generally. If we don't know about them and we don't treasure them, then we are foolish. And that is why I decided at a very tender age to become a sinologist. Unfortunately, it turned out not to be very practical, because to carry on doing that, I'd have had to play the Communist Party game, and I simply was not prepared to do so. They have basically, they have taken control of their own culture and used it for their own political ends. They've actually destroyed it. The Cultural Revolution was the opposite. It was a cultural destruction. Their modernization of the language, which is a very sensible thing to do in practice, has had the perverse consequence of ensuring that Chinese people who previously would have been able to read a document written 2,000 years ago with complete ease simply can't. My fellow students at Beijing University had great difficulty reading traditional Chinese. They were effectively as cut off from their own culture as you and I would have been if it was difficult to read Dickens. An absolutely extraordinary achievement. Cultural genocide inflicted on themselves.
So when you were a young boy, you were sort of interested in China, and then you go to university. And can you talk a bit about your experiences actually inside of China? And then later on, you join the Foreign Office and you become a British diplomat and you work on Chinese issues for many years. Can you talk a bit about those experiences as well, what that was like?
I was immensely fortunate coming up to university at the end of the 70s to coincide with, I think, that was the last generation of Chinese scholars who loved studying China for its own sake. They were under no real financial inducements to do or say anything that they didn't want to and to research any subject that they didn't want to, unlike, I'm afraid, the way things are now. British universities, like many other countries' universities, have been commercialised. They're businesses, and when following the money involves taking Chinese money, that has an enormous effect, as you can imagine, on syllabuses and styles and the range of discourse that you can have. I was insulated or protected from all of that. I couldn't even have conceived of it. So I was meeting people who perhaps were escapees from communist China. There was one former Red Guard who was a teacher of mine. There was also somebody who was an elderly Manchu aristocrat who knew the old imperial family and whose even older brother had been persecuted to death, forced to kneel on broken glass by the Red Guards. So I had a very clear view of the way that recent Chinese history had unfolded, and I knew a great deal about the way that it had developed and built itself up in the past. Other teachers of equal merit were from Western cultures, with their own particular angles. But one way or the other, I was given an incredibly valuable insight into the full range of really everything that China has to offer, and what I hadn't already learnt about, I was even more eager to learn more of. But I did feel after 4 years that I should go there. And as I say, I arrived in the immediate aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. I could speak very well, I could read, I could do anything really effectively. And as a result, unlike many foreigners who went there and sat in a classroom being taught the equivalent of what a Confucius Institute teaches now, I was a free agent in that regard. And I heard so many stories about what had happened, the loss of trust, most of all, between people and governors, people and rulers. That loss of trust is something which has scarred China even more than anyone realises, I think. And that is exactly what's happening to the rest of the world now. We've seen what this CCP edifice is. It is an organisation which does not believe in anything but struggle. Its relationships with the outside world are perceived in terms of people who are our rivals and are a threat to us, and people who are clients whom we can control. There is no middle ground, there's no middle way. And we've got to wake up to that. Now, I saw that full on when I went there to study for a year at that very early period. There was still naivety, there was still a hope that things could only get better because they'd been so bad. But all that was dashed. There was a little Peking Spring, as they called it in those days. Very soon things closed down again, and that was the end of it. And of course, that all ultimately ends up with Tiananmen and what's followed. So yes, that was my experience. And I came back with 3 more years of postgrad research and a bit of teaching Chinese to do ahead of me. And I thought, no, this isn't going to work. I simply cannot sign up to being any kind of scholar of China if I have to toe the party line. And I decided instead to use my knowledge in a more effective way to support British interests, which in those days principally focused around Hong Kong, by using my sinological skills. And all of it I have used and continue to use. The most obscure stuff has come out useful some way. And that led to an extremely interesting and I think a very rewarding career in the Foreign Office. I was privileged to do that, to spend time in Beijing again later, and to make the acquaintance of Chinese people once more, as well as many other diplomats who were far wiser about these matters than myself. So it's been a wonderful learning curve. I've never changed my admiration and affection for the people of China and for Chinese culture, and I never will.
Can you talk a bit about the people of China? Because most people in the West, we might see lots of videos the Chinese Communist Party has put out, or from Chinese state TV, of what China is like and the kind of culture of China. But I suspect that we're not getting a whole picture of what the Chinese people are like, how they think, what they think of their government necessarily. I mean, what experiences can you sort of tell us? What kind of insights can you give us into the difference perhaps between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party?
Yes. Well, Chinese people are Chinese people. They're just like you and me. They aspire to the same things. They aspire to security. They aspire to happiness. They aspire to health. They are strong believers in family, even though their family structures have been destroyed by the generations of one-child families. Nonetheless, there is that ideal of being part of an extended family, the sort of happy festivities that should have characterized China's New Year holiday this year are deeply family oriented, and respect for the old and a lot of what are the good sides of Confucianism and so on are deeply ingrained in China. What isn't really ingrained is a sense of religion as something transcending the human world. And that makes it all the easier for an essentially materialist system to take them over. But there is nonetheless a great instinct of faith. And that's why I said earlier that there are innumerable conversions to Christ, even now, and conversions to other religions too. There's something deep down in the Chinese soul that aspires to the transcendent. But there's not an awful lot of that available in a world where your decisions, your faith, your belief system has to be focused on sole loyalty to a sole dictatorial party. And that is how it is. So the contract, the social contract that kept people happy and working was growth, economic growth which I think may not be seen again for quite some time. And whether they'll be able to put up with that any more again than you or I will, if our society crumbles around us economically, remains to be seen. And the risks to the entire world if that happens, if there is a breakdown of control in China, are very great. But the risks of the imposition of that control in an arbitrary manner are one of the factors that is going to cause its own destruction. A more measured, a more open, a more collegiate, as I say, approach to governance generally, confidence in people, trust. The people will not have trust in a system that doesn't trust them. And it's far from clear that the Chinese Communist Party trusts its own people. That is not a stable setup.
We're going to finish the interview by talking about China's outlook into the next sort of few decades and what their plans are. But I just want to focus in finally on that point about the Chinese people and perhaps their kind of ambitions and differences, some differences between their views and the Chinese Communist Party. With coronavirus, we saw Dr. Li Wenlang. Now, he was a whistleblower doctor in December last year, and he said to his colleagues, "There's a new virus." He was a doctor in Wuhan, and he said, "There's a new virus going around. We need to be careful." And at this point, the Chinese Communist Party were denying that such a thing was happening, and they forced him to sign a confession saying that he'd made false and dangerous, or spreading was false and dangerous rumours. He would later go on to die from coronavirus. What happened there? What was the response from the Chinese people?
In the immediate aftermath of poor Dr. Li's death, there was on social media, which is now incredibly much part of life in China now, there was such an upsurge of grief, anger, resentment and blame for the system that had destroyed him that it shook the very foundations of the state. The Chinese government let it run for a little while, simply because it was such an extraordinary phenomenon, a bit like standing up in the face of a tsunami. But it became increasingly clear that the pressure was building to a dangerous level, and the censorship begins within 48 hours. Nonetheless, something that started then resulted in a most shameful phenomenon, namely that poor Dr. Li and about 7 of his other colleagues, medics who died around the same time, were hailed as people's martyrs, if you please, who had sacrificed their lives for the greater good of society. This is simply absurd. It is absolutely absurd. Their lives were wasted by the system that destroyed them and took the lives of so many others by hushing up the thing that they tried to expose. Even that, however, was conceded at one point, briefly. People were saying that it was, at a very high level, there were some statements which had been repudiated and wiped off the record now, that it would have been better to have listened to him, because not doing so caused a dreadful natural disaster to become a dreadful man-made disaster, if you please. Those words were stated by a very, very high-level official in a very senior judicial organ. That, of course, has now been eliminated from the record. So that shows us really what's going on. And it brings out my point about people would say so much. There is a dreadful enforced passivity, though. Have we time for a very quick little bit of poetry?
Go for it.
At a dreadful time in Chinese history, somebody wrote this very sad poem. And this, unfortunately, is the way that a lot of people in adversity think in China. When I was young, I did not know the taste of grief. I used to climb tall towers and forcibly compose romantic odes about grief. Now, I fully know the taste of grief. I would love to speak, but I do not. I would love to speak, but I remain silent and merely say, the air is cool. What a lovely autumn. Enough of these autumns. We need no more. Those people must speak up. They know the taste of grief and they deserve better. And if they cannot speak, we should speak for them. Not against China, but against the Chinese Communist Party.
Let's finish the interview just by giving a broad overview to people who perhaps are curious about what China wants and what their goals are in the future. Now, the communist parties are famous for having their 5-year plans, their 10-year plans, and China's certainly got a few of those. So can you just give people who may not know very much about China a kind of overview of what they want and what their plans are for the near future?
The Chinese Communist Party is capable of formulating plans in a way which is extraordinarily strategic. A lot of the time we think in Britain about plans that might last the next few months until the next budget or something like that. But China regularly can and does implement planning. It does planning that lasts a decade or more into the future. At the moment, the ones on the radar screen are called Made in China 2025 and China Standards 2030. And unless things grind to a halt in a way that they could, but obviously Beijing hopes they won't, those remain on the agenda and they're being pursued here and now. The former of those is pretty much what we see them doing on the export front, on further engagement in global markets. But it's an attempt now not just to choose some key industries for a special focus of effort, special sponsorship, special effectively state engagement and funding, but actually all Chinese industries. The Chinese government is attempting, or has been attempting until lately perhaps, to galvanize the highest quality, the highest energy, the highest scale of production across the entire production sector, so that Chinese goods will be the best in the market. They will be not only the most competitive, but they will be the most in demand, and that the careful probably sell for the highest prices. That is their plan, that by that time, Made in China 2025 will guarantee China a leading place in the world market. Now, the next level is really strategic. This is where you don't just play the game best, you write the rules yourself. That is an attempt, little by little, but they're starting again within the country, to establish frameworks of standards, professional descriptions of things that you are going to do or make or sell, or how you're going to sell them, or how you're going to regulate them, which at the moment exist principally in the sort of space that's defined by the World Trade Organization. But little by little, they believe, can be taken over by China itself. This is highly strategic. It is achievable, I fear, as well, and it is something which we must all realize would bring us to a point that we would effectively be living and breathing in a world where economies were subject to Chinese measurement, approval and control. And people who tried to sell things or do things that didn't fit up with that would simply be forced out of the market entirely. This is an extraordinary notion. It is unfortunately within their power to deliver. As long as they work within the constructs of existing multilateral organizations, they may succeed because they can subvert them. We've seen that. But ultimately, they don't even need that. Because if the world divides now and fragments and doesn't unify in resistance to this sort of thing, the dangers are very high. Now, I'd like to draw to your attention an important report that my organization, the Henry Jackson Society, has released today. And this describes the way in which Western nations, the Five Eyes nations, we chose that sample because it's relatively easy to talk about as a single unity, have become dependent on imports from China and have become dependent on investment from China as well. Now, this is something that cannot continue. Those dependencies no longer are sustainable. They're far too risky. And if we want the international rules-based order, free trade, free navigation, free markets, and all the other freedoms that the world needs to operate in a normal manner to be protected, we must realize that we all need to work together, not to exclude China, but to allow China and encourage China to include itself in the world that will benefit everyone, and not just a polarized, competitive, and zero-sum approach to the conduct of geostrategy.
Thank you very much, Matthew Henderson, for joining us. And if you want to read more about this topic, if you want to research a little bit more, you can go to the link in the description below and you can click on the Henry Jackson Society report that Matthew is just talking about there. And I urge you, go on the Henry Jackson Society website. You can read a lot more about the issues that we've discussed. So thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us.
Not at all, Stephen. A great pleasure.